The morning sky was calm and soft like a painting made of clouds and dreams, and the city below still yawned with sleepy streets, while a silver airplane waited on the runway shining under the first rays of sunlight, and its engines hummed with the quiet promise of a new journey ahead. And for everyone on board it was meant to be just another day. Families climbed the stairs with smiles and tired eyes, and business travelers checked their phones again and again while a few children ran between the seats laughing before their parents called them back, and among them sat a young doctor named Mia Lee, who carried her stethoscope like a lucky charm, and an old soldier named Mr. Hayes, who watched everything with calm, quiet eyes that had seen too much already, and beside them a little girl named Emily clutched her teddy bear tight because she was afraid of flying. The crew greeted everyone with warm voices and friendly smiles, and when the captain spoke through the speaker, his voice was confident like a promise of safety, and the plane lifted into the sky, leaving the ground far behind and inside the cabin. There was laughter and small talk, and the soft sound of seatbelts clicking. Mia looked out the window and saw the world growing smaller under the wings, and she thought about her mother waiting in London, and she smiled softly to herself, while Mr. Hayes beside her read an old newspaper folded neatly in half, and Emily pressed her face to the window whispering that the clouds looked like mountains of cotton candy, and her mother smiled though her eyes were full of worry. Everything felt peaceful and bright and normal, and for the first hour, it was nothing but the soft hum of engines, the clink of cups as flight attendants served coffee, and the low murmur of voices blending like music in the air. But peace never lasts forever, and fate often waits in silence before it strikes. 45 minutes after takeoff, something shifted in the air, something invisible yet heavy that made even the calmest hearts uneasy, and 3 men sitting in different rows suddenly stood up at the same time, their faces cold, their eyes hard, and before anyone could speak, one of them shouted in a deep voice that echoed through the cabin. Nobody move, and every sound stopped. The clinking of cups, the laughter, the quiet music all froze in a heartbeat, and for a moment there was only silence so thick it felt like the air itself had turned solid. Then the tall man lifted his hand, and everyone saw the dark shape of a gun, and fear spread like wildfire. People gasped, some screamed, some ducked under seats, and the flight attendants raised their hands shaking as one of the men moved toward the cockpit while the others blocked the aisles, telling everyone to stay down and do as they were told. And in that moment the plane stopped feeling like a safe space in the sky and became a cage with wings. Mia's heart pounded so fast she thought it might break her ribs, and she tried to stay calm, reminding herself to breathe, while Mr. Hayes watched the men carefully, noting their movements, their voices, their eyes, because he had seen fear before and knew what desperate people could do. And Emily hid under her mother's arm, whispering in a trembling voice, asking if they were going to die. The leader of the group barked orders to the others in a language most passengers did not understand, but his tone was sharp and angry, and one of the men kicked a bag aside, shouting for everyone to keep their heads down and not even think of being brave, and the sound of crying filled the air like a storm of pain and panic. The captain's voice came over the speaker, weak and shaking. "Please, everyone, stay calm. We are facing a difficult situation." And the sound of that calm voice made the fear even heavier, because it told them that this was real, and no one was coming to save them. Yet. Mia looked around and saw people holding hands, praying, whispering names of loved ones, and she felt the strange urge to help someone, though she did not know how, and Mr. Hayes leaned slightly forward, his eyes never leaving the men, his hands resting calmly on his knees, like a soldier waiting for the right time to move. Outside, the sky was still beautiful and blue, but inside the plane time had changed its meaning. Minutes felt like hours, and every second was a test of courage and patience, and no one dared to speak louder than a whisper. One of the hijackers walked slowly through the aisle, his boots heavy against the floor, his gun steady in his hand, and he stared at each face as if searching for something. Maybe weakness, maybe resistance, maybe just a sign of rebellion. And when he stopped near Emily's row, her mother pulled the girl close and whispered, "It's okay, baby, it's okay," even though nothing was okay. The man said nothing. He just stared for a moment, then moved on, and in that moment, Mia noticed something strange about him. His hands were shaking slightly, as if his anger was hiding something else, something like fear, and that small detail would stay in her mind. The passengers sat frozen, afraid to move, afraid to hope. And above them the engines kept roaring, carrying them through empty skies toward an unknown fate. And while the world below continued its normal rhythm of life, the people on Flight 307 were trapped in a story that would change everything. Then the plane made a small turn, and the leader spoke again, saying they had taken control. And if anyone tried to be a hero, they would all die. And his voice was cold but also tired, like a man carrying too much hate for too long. And as Mia looked out through the small round window at the endless blue, she whispered softly to herself, "Please, let this end, let us see home again." And somewhere deep inside her heart, she knew this was only the beginning of something far bigger than anyone on that plane could imagine. Inside the plane, the air was heavy and silent, and everyone could hear only the sound of their own hearts beating fast like drums of fear. And every small move felt dangerous. Every whisper felt like it could bring disaster. And in that silence, humanity began to show its truest faces. Some full of courage, some full of panic, some frozen between hope and despair. The leader of the hijackers stood in the aisle, tall and sharp, with eyes that looked like knives cutting through every soul in front of him. And when he spoke again, his voice was cold and steady, and he said this: "Plane now belongs to us, and everyone will stay quiet if they want to see another sunrise." And his words floated through the cabin like poison, turning courage into ice. The pilots in the cockpit were forced to follow their orders, the older captain, gripping the controls tight, his hands sweating as he listened to one of the men yelling directions, telling him to change course to somewhere unknown and far away, and the co-pilot beside him whispered quietly, asking what would happen to the passengers. But there was no answer, only the sound of heavy breathing. In fear, Mia sat in her seat watching everything, trying to make sense of the chaos around her, her mind spinning with questions she could not ask. And when she looked at Mr. Hayes, she saw that he was calm, though his eyes were sharp like a hunter's, waiting for the right moment. And she wondered how someone could stay so steady when death seemed so close. A few rows behind them, Emily clung to her mother, her little teddy bear crushed against her chest, and tears ran down her cheeks as she whispered, "I want to go home," and her mother kept saying, "Soon, my love, soon," though her voice trembled like paper in the wind, and her eyes begged for mercy from a sky that could not hear her. One of the hijackers moved down the aisle, checking the passengers, his face young but already hardened by hate and fear, and when his gaze met Mia's, he paused for a second, as if unsure of what to do, and then looked away quickly, his hand shaking slightly on his weapon. And Mia noticed that tiny tremble, the same one she had seen earlier, and something inside her heart whispered that he was not like the others. The flight attendants tried their best to stay calm, offering water to crying passengers, whispering small words of comfort, though their voices shook and their smiles were broken, and one of them, a woman named Rosa, tried to talk softly to the youngest hijacker, asking his name. But he only told her to sit down and keep quiet, though his voice cracked as if his heart was somewhere else, far away from violence. Mr. Hayes leaned closer to Mia and spoke in a whisper so quiet it was almost a breath, saying, "They are not all the same. One of them is scared. That is our window." And Mia looked at him, her mind torn between fear and hope, asking, "What can we do?" And he answered, "Wait and watch. Timing is everything." In the cockpit, the leader stood behind the captain, giving new directions, his eyes scanning the radar, his voice full of command, as he told them to fly toward the east, where they would make the world listen to their demands. And the captain nodded, knowing that any wrong word could end it all for everyone on board. Down in the cabin, one of the passengers, an old man with silver hair, started coughing hard, his wife crying beside him, begging for help, and Mia's instinct as a doctor took over. She rose from her seat, but one of the hijackers shouted, "Sit down," and aimed his gun at her. Yet the leader raised his hand and said, "Let her go. The man might die, and we need him alive for now." Mia hurried to the old man, her hands trembling but steady enough to do what she had trained for. And while she helped him breathe, she felt the eyes of the young hijacker on her, his face tense, his jaw tight. And when she looked up at him, their eyes met. And for a moment, she saw something human. There a flash of doubt, a silent question of why they were doing this. The minutes dragged like hours, and the passengers sat trapped in a floating prison above the clouds, and below them, the vast ocean waited cold and endless, and nobody knew if they would ever touch the ground again, alive and safe, and every small sound Became louder the rattle of a tray, the cry of a baby, the click of a gun. Suddenly, the leader shouted something in his own language, and one of the hijackers ran toward the back of the plane, opening a bag and pulling out a small device covered in wires and buttons, and when the passengers saw it, gasps filled the air like thunder rolling through the cabin, and the leader smiled coldly, saying, "Now they will listen to us." Fear turned into tears and prayers filled the cabin. People whispering promises, to God, to family, to themselves, that if they survived, they would never take life for granted again. And Mia sat down again, her mind racing, her heart heavy with the truth that this was far from over, and that somehow she would have to help save them all. The captain's voice came once more over the speaker, trying to sound calm, though the tremble in his words betrayed him, saying, "Passengers, please remain calm. We are doing everything we can to keep you safe." And his message ended with a small, static noise that made everyone flinch. Mia looked at Mr. Hayes and whispered, "This can't be the end," and he nodded quietly, replying, "Not yet." And as the engines hummed and the sky darkened ahead, the plane kept flying into the unknown, carrying fear, courage, and the first small spark of something greater that would soon show the true power of humanity. The sky outside had turned gray and heavy with clouds, and the sound of thunder echoed faintly far away, like the voice of something waiting, and inside the plane, fear still lived in every corner, but there was also something else now, a quiet strength building, slowly in the hearts of those who refused to give up. Mia sat in her seat, her mind racing with questions and fears and plans that made no sense, and she kept glancing toward the cockpit, where the leader of the hijackers stood like a shadow that would not move. And she could see how tense the pilots looked, how their hands moved slowly on the controls as if afraid that even air could betray them. Mr. Hayes watched everything with calm, sharp eyes, his body still but ready, and when Mia leaned closer, he whispered, "We must wait for the right moment. Patience is our weapon," and she nodded, though her stomach felt like it was tied in knots, because waiting meant listening to the cries and prayers around her, and feeling helpless while time slipped away like sand in a storm. Then suddenly a sound broke through the silence, a voice rough and angry calling out, "Doctor, come here now," and everyone turned their heads as one of the hijackers. The youngest one held his arm, bleeding, his face pale and his gun shaking, and the leader shouted at Mia again, "You help him or I shoot someone else." And for a moment her heart stopped. Mia stood slowly, her hands raised, her voice trembling as she said, "I am a doctor, I will help." And she walked down the narrow aisle, her knees weak, her breath short, and every step felt like walking through fire as passengers watched her with wide eyes, full of fear and hope mixed together. When she reached the man, she saw blood seeping through his sleeve, dark and warm, and he winced in pain, trying to hide it behind his anger, but his eyes gave him away. They were young eyes, scared eyes, human eyes, and she said softly, "I need to stop the bleeding," and he nodded almost without meaning to, as if his body trusted her more than his mind. She tore a strip from her scarf and pressed it against the wound, her hands moving carefully, her voice quiet and calm, telling him to breathe, and he did. And for a few seconds the cabin was silent, only the hum of the engines and the sound of her heartbeat echoing in her ears, and she could feel every eye watching her, every breath counting the seconds between life and death. The leader of the group stood nearby, watching her with suspicion, his gun still raised, and he asked coldly, "Why are you helping us?" And Mia looked up, meeting his eyes, and said, "Because I am a doctor. Because even if you hate us, I cannot hate you." And for the first time his face changed for just a moment. Confusion flickered across it before he looked away, pretending not to care. The young hijacker whispered something under his breath, something that sounded like "thank you," though. His voice cracked, and Mia saw tears gathering at the corners of his eyes, and she realized that deep inside he was lost, caught between loyalty and regret. And she wondered what kind of pain could turn someone so young into this. As she finished bandaging the wound, she whispered quietly, "You do not have to do this," and his eyes darted toward the leader, then back at her, and he said nothing. But she saw the truth in his silence. He was not sure anymore. Meanwhile, Mr. Hayes kept his eyes fixed on them, memorizing every move, every weakness. And when Mia returned to her seat, he leaned closer and whispered, You have planted a seed." And she nodded, not fully understanding, but feeling it deep inside, that something had changed. However small. The passengers began to whisper among themselves, soft words of comfort and courage passing between rows like invisible threads connecting strangers. And though fear still ruled the cabin, a small light had begun to grow in that darkness, a light of quiet defiance, a belief that not all was lost. The plane shook slightly as it hit rough air, and the leader shouted at the pilots, his voice harsh and full of anger. But the older captain replied calmly, saying, "We are running low on fuel and cannot keep this course for long," and the leader cursed under his breath, banging his fist against the door and yelling, "Change direction." Now, outside lightning flashed, turning the clouds white for a second, and the sound of thunder rolled across the sky like a warning from the heavens and inside the cabin. People prayed quietly, clutching the hands of strangers as if holding on to life itself. Mia closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer too. Not just for herself, but for everyone trapped there, even the ones with guns, because she knew that hate was only another kind of cage, and somewhere inside even they were afraid. The young hijacker sat near the aisle, his bandaged arm resting on his lap, his eyes distant and lost, and Mia noticed how he flinched whenever the leader shouted, how his hand shook when he gripped his weapon, and she knew that fear and doubt were eating him from the inside like fire under ice. Then without warning, the captain's voice came again, weak but steady, saying, "This is your captain. Speaking, we have been forced to change course. Please remain calm," and his voice cracked on the last word, and the leader turned, shouting orders again, pacing like a beast trapped in its own rage. Emily began to cry softly against her mother's shoulder, whispering, "I want to go home," and Mia's chest ached with helplessness as she looked around the cabin at all those faces full of fear, yet still clinging to hope, and she thought maybe hope itself was the strongest thing left among them as the engines roared and the storm grew closer. The young hijacker looked up one last time, meeting Mia's eyes, and in that look she saw a silent promise, something unspoken but powerful, and she understood that the story of this flight was no longer just about terror. It was about choices, about what people become when everything falls apart, and about how even in fear humanity can still shine. The storm outside began to grow like a living thing, its voice roaring across the sky as lightning painted flashes of white fire against the clouds, and thunder rolled deep like the growl of a sleeping giant. Waking up and inside the plane, the passengers felt every shake, every drop, every tremor that came from above and below, and within their hearts. Mia gripped her seat, her fingers cold, her breath uneven, and she tried to calm herself, repeating in her mind that fear would not help anyone. And beside her, Mr. Hayes kept his calm face, though his jaw tightened as the plane dipped slightly, and the sound of metal creaking filled the air, reminding everyone how fragile they really were. The leader of the hijackers shouted orders in anger, blaming the pilots for the turbulence, but the older captain replied with a steady voice, saying, "We are flying through a storm and I cannot control the sky." And for a moment even the leader had no words, because the truth of nature is stronger than the will of man. Emily held her mother's hand, whispering that she wanted to see the ground again, and her mother told her to keep her eyes closed and think of her favorite song, and she began to hum softly a broken tune, trembling with tears, while around them people prayed in whispers, and the young hijacker sat still, lost in his own world, his eyes wet, his arm aching under the bandage that Mia had wrapped. Mia looked toward him and saw the way his lips moved, like he was talking to himself, maybe praying, maybe remembering something, and she felt that strange mix of fear and pity that had followed her since the moment this nightmare began, and deep inside she wondered if kindness could still change something in the hearts of those who had already chosen darkness. The lightning flashed again, and the plane dropped for a second, sending a wave of screams through the cabin, and cups and bags fell to the floor, and one of the flight attendants hit her shoulder against a seat. But she stood up again, trying to help others and shouting for everyone to stay calm, though her voice shook like glass in the wind. Mr. Hayes leaned forward, his sharp eyes studying the hijackers, and he whispered to Mia, "We are closer now. The storm is our cover. We must be ready," and she looked at him confused, asking ready for what? And he replied quietly, for the right moment to act, and his voice carried a weight that made her heart race, because she knew he meant something dangerous, something that could end everything in one instant. Young hijacker glanced at them as if he had heard something but said nothing. Instead, he turned his face to the window and stared at the lightning dancing across the clouds, and Mia could almost see the battle inside him. The fight between what he was told to do and what he still wanted to believe was right. In the cockpit, the captain struggled to keep control. His hands firm, but his eyes tired, and he thought of his family waiting at home, wondering if they would ever see him again, and the co-pilot beside him whispered a prayer under his breath as rain began to lash against the windows, and the lights flickered twice before returning weak and dim. The leader shouted that they would not fail, that their cause was greater than fear, but his voice cracked at the edges, his anger breaking under the weight of the storm and the silence of those who no longer believed in him. And when he turned around, his men avoided his eyes. Even the young one who once followed his every word now sat quietly like a shadow of what he was before. Mia saw that, and hope flickered inside her, a small fragile flame, but enough to make her sit taller and whisper to the people around her, telling them to stay calm, to breathe, to hold on, because storms do not last forever. And her voice, though small, carried through the rows like a thread of light in a sea of darkness. Mr. Hayes began to study the movements of the hijackers, their patterns, their blind spots, the way the leader turned his back when shouting, and the way the young one hesitated every time his weapon rose, and he whispered again to Mia, soon. And she nodded, though fear still danced in her chest like a trapped bird. Then the plane shook violently again, and the oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, swinging like ghosts in the dim light, and the screams grew louder, and the leader shouted for silence, but no one could hear him over the roar of wind and thunder. And for a moment, chaos took control of everything. In that chaos, the young hijacker stood up, shouting at the leader, saying, "We must let them land, we will all die." And the leader turned on him furious, his face red with rage, his gun raised, and the two stared at each other, eyes locked, one filled with fury, the other with fear and regret. And for the first time, the passengers saw cracks in the wall of terror that had surrounded them. Mia's heart pounded as she saw it happening. She whispered to Mr. Hayes, "This is it. This is the change." And he nodded, his hands ready, his eyes never blinking as the leader shouted again, but the storm outside screamed louder, drowning his words, and the plane kept shaking like it too wanted to break free from the violence inside. Emily cried out as thunder exploded. Above them, her mother hugging her tightly, whispering over and over that it would be okay. And Mia closed her eyes for a second, praying silently that the storm would take their fear away and leave them a chance to survive. When she opened her eyes, the young hijacker was staring at her again, and in his gaze there was something new, something that looked almost like courage or maybe surrender. And she understood that the storm was not only outside, it was inside every soul on that plane, twisting, breaking, and revealing what was truly human. The leader shouted for control once more, but his voice no longer carried power, and the plane dove into darkness, surrounded by lightning and rain. And within that chaos, hope began to take root, stronger than fear and deeper than hate. The storm outside raged like an angry sea, swallowing the sky with lightning that flashed again and again, turning faces white for seconds before vanishing back into darkness, and the plane felt like it was fighting for breath against the wind that wanted to tear it apart. And inside that trembling metal cage, every heartbeat like a clock counting down to something unknown. The leader shouted at the pilots, his voice raw with fear and rage, demanding that they climb higher, but the captain shook his head, saying the engines cannot take it. And the leader hit the wall with his fist, screaming that they would not fail, and that they would be remembered. And his words echoed through the cabin like fire spreading across dry wood. Mia held the armrest tightly, her knuckles pale as she watched the young hijacker who sat a few rows away. His head lowered, his gun resting on his knees, and his lips moving in silent words she could not hear. And when lightning struck, again she saw tears on his face, and she knew he was breaking from the inside, torn between what he had been told to do and what his heart still wanted to be. Mr. Hayes leaned toward her, his voice low and steady, saying, "This is the moment they are not united anymore. We can turn this around." And she looked at him, fear rising inside her throat as she whispered, "What if we fail?" And he answered quietly, "We already fail. If we do nothing." A sudden jolt threw everyone forward as the plane dropped sharply, and screams filled the cabin like a wave of pain. and the oxygen mask swung wildly from the ceiling, and one of the attendants fell, but stood again holding onto a seat, trying to help an old man who had fainted, and the chaos grew louder. With every second, the leader turned his gun toward the pilot, shouting that they were trying to kill everyone, and the captain raised his trembling hands, saying, "We are losing fuel. We must make an emergency landing, or we will not survive." And the leader shouted, "No, we go where I say." And before he could finish, the young hijacker stood up and shouted, "Enough." The word cut through the air like thunder, silencing even the storm for a moment, and all eyes turned toward him, his gun shaking in his injured hand, his voice cracking as he said, "We will all die if we do not land. You are killing them. You are killing us." And the leader turned slowly, his eyes filled with fury. "You betray your brothers," he shouted, stepping closer, raising his weapon, and the young hijacker shook his head, saying, "I am saving them and saving myself." And his eyes met Mia's for a second, and she could see the decision written there, a desperate kind of courage born from pain and guilt. The leader lunged forward, and the two men struggled, their bodies slamming against the seats, and the passengers screamed, ducking as the guns waved wildly, and Mr. Hayes stood from his seat, moving faster than anyone expected, his soldier's instincts waking from long sleep, and he grabbed one of the hijackers from behind. Wrestling the weapon away, Mia froze for a moment, then acted, her body moving on instinct as she shouted for the others to help, and a few passengers rose too, their fear melting into something else. Something fierce and human, and together they fought, pushing back against the terror that had ruled them for so long. The young hijacker managed to knock the leader's arm aside, and the gun fell sliding across the floor as lightning flashed again, making it glimmer for a split second before vanishing under a seat, and the leader roared in anger, swinging his fist at the boy. But Mr. Hayes was already there, pulling him back, holding him down with the strength of all the pain he had carried since his days as a soldier. Mia rushed to the cockpit, her voice shaking as she said to the captain, "Do whatever you must. We have to land now." And the captain nodded, sweat pouring down his face as he shouted to the co-pilot to send a distress signal and start descent, and the plane began to turn, the engines whining as they fought against the storm. Behind her, chaos still raged, the leader screaming, the passengers crying, and the young hijacker kneeling on the floor, his face in his hands, whispering over and over, "I am sorry. I am sorry." And Mia felt tears in her own eyes because she knew he meant it, and that forgiveness was sometimes heavier than guilt. The plane dipped lower and lower, and the captain's voice came over the speaker, trembling, but firm, saying, "Everyone brace for landing," and his words were followed by the sound of people praying in every language, whispering promises and dreams and goodbyes as they clung to one another. Mr. Hayes shouted for everyone to hold tight as the leader broke free from his grip for a second, reaching for the fallen gun, but the young hijacker moved faster, throwing himself between the leader and the weapon, and the sound of the struggle filled the cabin like thunder inside the heart. Then a loud bang echoed through the air, not from lightning but from metal meeting metal, and the lights flickered again as the plane began its final dive through the storm. The ocean below, now visible through flashes of light, vast and endless and dark, like the mouth of fate itself. Mia grabbed Emily and her mother, pulling them close, her voice steady, now saying, hold on," as the cabin filled with the roar of the engines and the cries of hope and terror blending into one, and even as fear tried to crush them, the people on that plane held on to each other tighter than ever before. In the front, the captain whispered to himself, "Just a little longer, almost there," and the co-pilot nodded as rain pounded against the glass, and the plane shook harder, but still obeyed their hands, and far behind them the passengers waited, hearts united by the same fragile wish to live. The leader shouted one last time, his words lost in the thunder, as the plane broke through the final layer of clouds and saw the ocean rising fast, and in that moment, everything slowed. The fear, the sound, the storm itself, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for what humanity would do next. The ocean rose beneath them, dark and endless, while the storm screamed around the plane, tearing at its wings, and the sound of the engines roared through the cabin like the heart of a frightened giant. And yet inside that chaos, something beautiful was beginning to grow, something that had been waiting all along, hidden beneath fear and pain. Mia held Emily close, her arms tight around the little girl. As the mother beside her whispered prayers through tears and across the aisle, strangers held hands as if they had known each other forever, because in that moment every barrier between them was gone, and only one truth remained that they all wanted, to live, and that they all needed one another. Mr. Hayes stood near the front, still breathing hard, his arms aching from the fight, but his eyes steady on the leader who now lay pinned to the floor by two passengers, one holding his arm, the other gripping. His legs, their faces pale but determined, and for the first time since the nightmare began, the balance of power had shifted. The young hijacker sat on the floor shaking his head, his injured arm pressed against his chest, whispering words of apology, to no one and to everyone. And Mia looked at him and saw not an enemy but a broken boy who had finally remembered that he was human, and she felt something like forgiveness in her heart, even in the middle of terror. The captain shouted over the speaker, his voice trembling but alive, saying, "Brace for impact, we are landing on water." And those words carried both fear and hope at once, and people obeyed, holding on, tightening their seat belts, closing their eyes, and whispering silent promises to the sky. The storm howled louder, as if refusing to let them go, lightning flashing across the windows like fire from the heavens. But still the pilots fought the controls, guiding the wounded plane toward the sea below. And every second felt endless. Every breath felt like the last, and yet no one gave up. Mia felt her body shaking, but her mind clear as she whispered to Emily, "You are brave, remember that." And the little girl nodded through tears, clutching her teddy bear against her heart. And somewhere, deep inside that tiny gesture, lit a spark that warmed the entire row of passengers as they waited for whatever was to come. Then the impact came like thunder. Meeting Earth, the plane hit the water with a deafening crash, throwing waves high into the stormy air, and everything shook. People screamed, luggage flew, oxygen masks swung wildly, and then for a moment there was only darkness and the sound of rushing water. When Mia opened her eyes, she felt the cold spray on her face, and the plane tilted slightly, but it was not sinking, not yet, and she realized they had landed, they were alive. And she began shouting, "We made it. We are alive." And her voice broke through the cries and sobs, spreading hope like fire through frozen hearts. The captain's voice came again, weak but full of relief, saying, "Stay calm, stay seated, rescue teams are on their way." And though no one could see him, every soul on that plane felt his courage, his unbreakable will shining through the storm. Mr. Hayes moved down the aisle, helping people unbuckle their belts, guiding them to safety doors that the crew were trying to open, against the pressure of the water and wind. And every time he reached a frightened passenger, he said the same words, "You are not alone." And somehow those words gave them strength to move. Mia helped the wounded young hijacker, who looked at her with eyes full of regret, and she said, "Come with us. You can still make things right." And he nodded, tears mixing with the rain as he followed her, toward the back where people were gathering near the emergency exits, praying for light to break through the clouds. Outside, the sea was wild waves slamming against the floating plane, but in the distance faint red lights blinked through the fog, rescue helicopters fighting their way through the storm, guided by the signal the pilots had sent in their final moments of fuel. And inside the cabin, cheers began to rise, weak, at first, then stronger, louder, until it became a song of life itself. Emily looked out the window and whispered, "I see them. I see the lights." And her mother hugged her tight, laughing and crying at the same time. And even Mr. Hayes allowed himself a tired smile as he helped lift an elderly woman toward the open exit where inflatable rafts waited like small islands of safety in the chaos. The young hijacker helped too, his trembling hand steadying a crying child as he said, "Go first. You are safe now." And Mia watched him, realizing that redemption could come even from the deepest shadow, and that sometimes humanity showed its power not in strength but in mercy. As the last passengers climbed into the rafts, the plane began to sink slowly, its nose dipping into the water. But the storm was finally breaking the clouds, above tearing apart to reveal the first light of dawn glowing faintly across the horizon, and the sea that had looked so dark now shimmered with pale gold like hope reborn. The helicopters lowered ropes, and voices shouted above the wind, and one by one the survivors were lifted into the sky, leaving behind the broken plane that had carried their fear and their courage through the longest night of their lives. And when Mia's turn came, She looked back once at the ocean, whispering, "Thank you," before she rose into the light. Later, when the world heard the story, they called it the miracle above the Atlantic, and people everywhere cried when they learned how strangers had become family. How a soldier, a doctor, a mother, and even a broken boy had chosen life over hate, and how humanity had proved its true strength when it mattered most. And as the survivors stood together, wrapped in blankets on the rescue ship, watching the sun rise over the calm water, there was silence. Not from fear, but from awe, because they had seen something greater than terror, greater than death. They had seen the power of hearts united, and somewhere far above, where clouds drifted softly in peace again, the sky itself seemed to whisper that in the darkest moments it is not fear that saves us, but love and the courage to be human.